I have a question that is sort of pertaining to what the Sacramentology, the differences between Catholic and Orthodox understandings, at least. So, as far as I understand it, Catholics believe that there is something the priest receives that is called a charism, and that this remains even after the priest being defrocked.
Right.
Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, you could become a Satanist 1 minute after your ordination, and you will forever be able to confect the Eucharist in the Roman Catholic view.
Yes. That is one thing. So, I mean, my question is about your opinion or pointing to certain sources on this. But the other is, there was a scandal with a certain Catholic priest after the video of his baptism showed that the priest who was baptizing him didn't say, "I baptize you," but he said, "We baptize you."
Yeah.
And that would, in their understanding, meant that the baptism was invalid.
Correct.
And consequently, all of the sacraments performed by that priest later on were also invalid.
Right.
So, as far as I know, the Orthodox understanding is that if you're defrocked, that's it. And we also, I've never heard of such a thing where, as you mentioned, the set of occultists who believe that if you cough during Mass or something, that renders it invalid and whatever. So could you explain it to me a bit more? Because to me it's just completely ridiculous.
Right. So the reason that the Roman Catholic Church adopted this position was through a series of debates that Augustine had with the Donatists. So first we need to understand that debate. And that debate is conditioned on a question about sacramentology that precedes Augustine through the Novatianists. So the Novatianists and other people kind of early on, like in the time of Cyprian and Tertullian, and other groups, they had this idea that if you, for example, sinned after baptism, you're done, right? You're out of here. They had this really wild, rigorous view. They also referred to people who were what they called traditores, who were the people who, for example, if the Roman authorities came and said, "Do you have the Bible? We're here to confiscate the Bible and arrest you." If they gave up the texts that were hidden, they were called traditores. And so a lot of these people had a purist view that if you committed, and it was kind of different groups had different lists of the sins that were unforgivable, right? So this sparked an early debate in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the church about what happens to people that sin after baptism. Can they be restored? So you get these really rigorous types of positions that said, no, they're done, they have to be excommunicated. Well, beyond that, there came a question of, well, what about heresy in the church? What if a minister believes a heresy? And this sparks a debate between St. Cyprian and Pope St. Stephen. Pope St. Stephen said, well, by tradition, we believe that you can be forgiven and be returned to the participation of the sacraments, and also that there can be, in some instances, the performance of a sacrament in terms of validity outside the church. So St. Cyprian had a very rigorous view, and in the history of the church, even though he's still a saint, he didn't split the unity of the church. The church did not, in the succeeding ecumenical councils, come to completely agree with St. Cyprian. In fact, the church sided with, especially by the 5th council in the condemnation of the Donatists, they sided with Pope St. Stephen. So that's step one. I'm not saying you don't get this, but people get really lost in this. So let's understand that context first. Next, let's move to the dispute between Augustine and the Donatists, because this is where the dispute becomes confusing, because we, as Orthodox, accept some of Augustine, but not everything in Augustine. The Roman Catholic Church eventually ends up accepting basically all of Augustine's position and adding on other of their own logical conclusions out of Augustine's Sacramentology. So let's see where we do agree with Augustine in this dispute. And if you read the anti-Donatist works, I've read all of those. So I'm just saying, I'm not tooting my horn, but I'm saying I do know this debate, because when I was a Calvinist, this debate became very crucial to me, because I was worried, hey, wait a minute, what if as a Calvinist I'm basically a form of a Donatist position? So I went and I read all of the anti-Donatist works, and I was like, okay, man, it's looking like Augustine definitely has a much better argument. And as Orthodox, we would agree that overall in this dispute, a la the Fifth Council. Most of in the majority of the argumentation here, we side with Augustine on this issue. However, we don't accept everything that Augustine believes. And this dispute between the Donatists was basically this: if you believe or hold to a heresy, then you also lose the grace of performing the sacrament. And Augustine argues with the Donatists in vast swaths of argumentation that, well, let's work this out here. So if that's the case, then doesn't it also follow that, it's not like heresy is the only sin that excludes grace, right? What if you have dirty thoughts? Doesn't that also remove grace? Well, yeah, okay. And so basically what Augustine keeps doing is boxing the Donatists further and further into more and more radical positions to show the absurdity of the position. And so he keeps reasoning them through all these conclusions to say, well, if sin is what removes grace, not just heresy, then every sin can also be something internal in the minister, and now nobody would ever know if they were baptized. Because isn't it possible that, let's say you had the holiest priest of all time, let's say that at the point of your baptism, suddenly he's flooded with dirty thoughts because there's, a good looking little mamacita over there at the baptism. Oh, well, guess what? You didn't actually get baptized because all that grace was gone. That's the logical conclusion of the Donatist position that Augustine refutes. Now, Augustine proposed several other things in this dispute that would become normative in Roman Catholic theology, such as ex opere operato, right? He argues that the sacraments work by the working of the work itself, not by the righteousness of the minister. So because the minister operates in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, in the Roman Catholic view, it's never dependent upon the individual faith of the minister. The minister operates, it's Christ is there working through the minister, even if he's a sinful minister. And this was seen to be the sufficient answer to the Donatists on the part of St. Augustine. Now, as we come up into the councils, we have to understand, the later councils after Augustine, we have to understand that in the East, there wasn't any de facto acceptance of everything that Augustine argued. Most of the people in the East didn't even read Augustine's works until much later, right? So if we look at, for example, the festal letters of St. Athanasius, we don't see an ex opere operato identical move that we see in Augustine. And I'm just using St. Athanasius as an example to say, because a lot of Roman Catholics, if they hear what we would describe as our position, they go, oh, you're a Donatist. Oh, really? You think St. Athanasius was a Donatist? I mean, that's kind of silly, right? St. Athanasius says, for example, that there might be the performance of a ritual, and it might be considered valid in a sense, but that doesn't mean that there's grace outside the church necessarily, or that you can perform the sacraments without the faith. So the key point of departure here with Augustine and the Augustinian Sacramentology is that Augustine maintains that the sacraments can be performed with both grace and validity in terms of the ritual outside of the confines of the visible, quote, Catholic Church. And the Orthodox view never admitted to that degree of the Sacramentology of Augustine. So we don't believe that if you lose the faith, you're still granting the grace. There might be a valid form, but the heresies of schism and the sin of heresy and schism are such that they remove one from the body. So you're not part of the church anymore. So even if the church, in terms of economia, recognizes that you perform the ritual right, and the church receives you on the basis of your, say, rejecting of the heresy, it doesn't mean that there was grace outside the church in terms of sacramental grace. There was an impediment to the grace, which was there to, even though the ritual was performed correctly, there was an impediment to the grace. But when you join the church, the impediment is removed, and now you're experiencing the grace that was there all along. So that's my understanding of what later councils say, and this particularly would be at Trullo. There's different canons in Trullo which say that it depends on the situation. So in other words, could the church, for example, let's say there was a Coptic baptism that was identical to the ritual and the rite of an Orthodox baptism. Could the church accept somebody and receive them by chrismation, and would the grace be present there because it was basically all done the right way? Yes, as long as they have the right faith and the ritual was performed in an acceptable way according to what the canons dictate are acceptable and non-acceptable forms. For example, there's one canon which says that if there was a single immersion, there should be a baptism performed, because single immersion is usually associated with eunomianism. The eunomians baptized in a single immersion. And so because it carried with it the idea of eunomian anti-Trinitarian theology, the church thought it better to, in that case, make it normative to do the baptism in terms of a full-on Trinitarian immersion, because that's the way that the Orthodox Church does baptism, right? So that's part of the story when we're getting up into the 5th and 6th councils, and then of course Trullo is accepted at the 7th council, which makes those also ecumenical. So where we start to get weird in the Latin view is that after the I don't remember the exact date, but it's in Denzinger. There's a specific statement in Denzinger where in the West, by the early Middle Ages, they were already accepting the full-on Augustinian thesis, and even going to the further conclusions by saying what's necessary for the performance of a sacrament is matter, form, and intention. And so you can do that whether you're a visible participant in the Roman Catholic Church or not. And they go so far as to say that an atheist and a Muslim can baptize somebody. That's in Denzinger. Okay, that's Roman Catholic dogma. So they go so far with the absurdity of what on the face sounds like a liberal position, because when people first get into this debate, they think, oh, Augustine's position is the liberal position on sacraments, and Orthodox are rigorous. That's actually not the case. In fact, the logical conclusions of the Augustinian ex opere apparato position lead to a scholastic definition that the sacraments are matter, form, and intention, the form being the words that are said, and they have to be like magic words said precisely and exactly. So what you're referring to in these, and there's been many of these cases, by the way. There was a case in Arizona where for decades a Novus Ordo priest had been baptizing people, and they're all considered invalid because he didn't say the magic words right. Right? I mean, in Orthodox view, that would be kind of absurd, right? I mean, there's some strictures as to, like, I can't say I baptize you in the name of the sea, the land, and the air, which some Novus Ordo churches have done, by the way. I mean, obviously that wouldn't be proper words, but to accidentally say, we instead of I mean, that's just kind of ridiculous, right? It's treating all of this like a magic formula, and that's how trads, especially if you look at what is it, De Defectibus, I think it is, where you go back to the Tridentine Mass, and there's all these lists of things that destroy the validity. It gets insane, right? It's like super spurg mode, right? It's crazy. And it's just totally foreign to the attitude of the church when it comes to economia and not being overly rigorous. And the irony is that the Orthodox position is the one that's not actually crazy rigorous. It's the one that says you don't just have minister and church. You also have to, you don't just have matter, form, and intention. There's also got to be the faith. And that's what Athanasius says in his letter, is that there's no grace or sacraments outside the church because there's no faith outside the church. And does this make sense as to why things are so different between us? So what we would say is that the Orthodox Church position is that the reason that economia comes into this is that different people's situations and different people's backgrounds are different. And so there's not going to be a one size fits all for everybody. You might could argue that there should be. I think Rocor has that attitude that it would just be easier overall, especially given the profusion of the numbers of cults and crazy sects nowadays. It makes more sense to just have one way to receive people, rather than an unwise practice of everybody doing whatever they want, which lends to the ecumenist bent. So ecumenists seize upon this, and they try to twist it to, we see everybody has baptism because we can receive people by chrismation. That's not what's being said. Just because somebody's received by chrismation does not mean that they had grace per se in the sacramental celebration in those heterodox groups. Maybe God's granting them grace. We don't know that. But from the vantage point of public recognition, and canon law is often dealing with public recognition, public profession. For example, a cleric who publicly attends the ceremonies of heterodox groups is supposed to be under clerical suspension. You're not supposed to publicly participate in other groups' liturgies and worship services. That's against the canons. But it doesn't mean that we sit here and try to judge people's inner motives and inner intentions. We can't do that. That's impossible. You can't know that. So we go by the public stance, the public profession. And if the church receives people by chrismation, even if they did it wrongly, let's say there was a bishop who was an ecumenist. Let's say he was a secret ecumenist, and he received somebody who should have been baptized. Let's say they were baptized as a crazy sect, and it was totally mangled and foreign to the Orthodox idea of what baptism is. Well, I don't think that we're such sticklers that the grace of baptism is withheld from them, because we know, for example, just on the basis of baptism of desire and baptism of blood, those people have baptism of desire, right? They're getting the grace, just like a catechumen who dies before being baptized is considered saved and considered part of the church. So it's no different than people who, bishops failed to receive them in a wise and proper way. It's not their fault that the bishop made that mistake or didn't do it right. That's just ridiculous to get into this extreme attitude of rigorism. But I do agree that the economia is abused by people who are ecumenists. So both of those things can be true. And again, I'm just stressing that the irony is that when you come to this dispute, level one is to think that the Augustinian position is the liberal position and the Orthodox position is rigorous. But in actual fact, the opposite is the case. The Orthodox position is actually the sensible and liberal, quote unquote, in a good sense. I don't mean liberal in a moral sense, but liberal in the sense of understanding and accepting God's grace as proven through baptism of desire, baptism of blood. And yet the Augustinian position, and by extension, the ex opere operato position that Rome eventually accepts, where you can be an atheist or a Muslim and baptize people, which is just preposterous, or you can be ordained a priest, the next day become a Satanist, but for the rest of your life, you can confect the Eucharist as a Satanist. That's literally the Roman Catholic position, okay? Do people not understand that this is silly? Okay? That's their position. This is dumb. And no, obviously that's not the position of any of the Eastern Fathers. And that does not make the Eastern Fathers Donatists. So I don't know why we can't move past. Now, I'm not saying you, Posh, but I'm saying that, people get caught up in this debate, and it is kind of nuanced. But really, if we understand the spirit of the church, the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, the spirit of the law, I think we would have a lot more understanding on this issue.
Right. Thank you, first of all. I'm working on a sort of critique of the idea of sacred languages. This is why I'm asking this, because I've heard someone like Dr. Taylor Marshall say that older prayers didn't say, God bless this bread, but said, bread be blessed, and somehow that makes it more blessed or something. And it is this strange notion to me, but do you think this is why the Protestants tend to equate the idea of how they see the Catholics, how they see prayer and sacraments, they equate it with magic and paganism, because it's this sort of techne, this sort of spiritual technology.
In part, yes.
Opposed to prayer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the medieval scholastic Latin attitude of the attempt to have a scientific definition of all these things, and that's literally what it is. So you have to understand that in the medieval Latin attitude, they think that it's a scientific definition of the sacraments and how they're performed and what's necessary. I mean, this is just silly, right? I mean, it's just absurd. And although the Protestants go crazy with it, they're overreacting to that extreme. Absolutely.
Right. All right. That's what I had to ask.
Yeah, and I think let me make sure. I think it's either quo primus or de defect. I think it's de defectibus, because that would be defects, right? De defectibus would be Pius V's papal bull. The trads love this. If you looked up de defectibus, it goes through all of the defects. And this is just a classic for trads in terms of their spurgitude, to go nuts with it, right? Because, I mean, this is the document by which we would literally be, if you cough during the consecration, that you're basically, that's a mortal sin, and it's not the Eucharist. And
Right.
and this is why in a lot of trad circles, I'm not joking, by the way. I've met tons of SSP, well, not tons, but I've met many SSPX priests. A lot of them have extreme forms of obsessive compulsive disorder because they're under the impression that the slightest little thing, coughing would during the consecration would constitute a horrendous mortal sin.
Okay, I understand. I've written things down to look up afterwards, like the defectibus, etc.
Yeah, I put that in the chat too for people listening. So if you go to the YouTube chat, I linked De Defectibus right there, and that is the bull of Pius the fifth. Yeah.
All right. That's all I had.
Okay, yeah, those are great questions, Posh, and keep up the good work, man.
Thank you. You as well, and God bless.
You too. Yeah, that's it's not easy to boil down all of the sacramental nuance, and a lot of people who get into this, they immediately sort of adopt extreme positions, which we don't have to adopt these extreme positions if we just understand, in my view, that look, God's a gracious God. That doesn't mean that we should fall over into some kind of crazy ecumenism but there's the extreme rigor in Rome, and there's extreme rigor in some of the fringe Orthodox circles, right? I'm speaking of the TO people here, and that is just another version of Donatism, right?